Hi friends, welcome back to the channel and welcome to part 3 of our series on how to build your own Apollo spacecraft out of leather. In the previous videos, we've already crafted the circular back frame and the booster support. In this video, we'll focus on creating the booster itself and preparing it for assembly with the support structure. While it's easier to stitch the booster in smaller sections, we want to get it ready for the final assembly. As with the other parts we've worked on so far, the booster requires stability. To achieve this, we'll use 1mm vegetable-tanned leather as the lining for the 4 parts needed for this assembly. First, we'll dye the leather before gluing it to the blue goatskin. For this, I'll be using leather dye from EcoFlow and a large wool dauber. You'll notice that the first and second coats of dye aren't very strong, which is why I applied a third coat to achieve a rich navy color. However, if you want your leather to be even darker, you can opt for a black dye or apply additional coats of navy blue. Once the dye is dry, after about an hour, it's time to buff and polish the leather with some carnauba cream. Start by grabbing a small piece of cotton cloth to buff the leather and remove any excess dye. Then use another cloth to evenly apply a layer of carnauba cream across the entire surface. Let the cream sit for about 20 minutes to fully absorb into the leather. Afterward, buff the leather again with the cotton cloth and you'll immediately notice the difference. Polishing the leather with carnauba cream not only gives its beautiful finish but also adds a protective layer. Just be sure to use this cream only on vegetable tanned leathers like the one I'm using for this project. This is how the leather looks after a proper buffing. Now we're ready to glue the blue goatskin to the vegetable tanned leather. Carefully arrange your pieces on the leather and apply glue to both sides of the surfaces you'll be joining together. You can use a leather pen to mark where each piece will be positioned. Once the glue is dry, cut each individual piece using scissors or a leather knife. As in the previous videos, use the template to mark the outer limits of each piece and the stitching holes with a scratch awl. Next, use a round chisel and poly mallet to punch each stitching hole. Be sure to place a poly block or cutting mat underneath the leather to protect your work surface. After punching all the holes, trim any excess leather using a leather knife or X-Acto knife. Now we can move on to painting the edges. Although most edges will be stitched edge to edge and remain unseen, painting them is a good precaution. If any edges are visible between the stitching, having them pre-painted and polished ensures a clean and professional look. Apply 1 or 2 coats of edge paint, allowing each coat to dry completely before proceeding. To stitch the pieces together, start with the larger parts. I'll be using linen thread that matches the blue leather. Begin by aligning and joining the sides of both larger pieces. Unlike polyester thread, linen thread doesn't come pre-waxed, which is one advantage of polyester. However, since there's no polyester thread that matches the blue leather I'm using, we'll need to wax the linen thread ourselves. Next, install the needles. Flatten the tip of the thread, insert it to the needle's eye and stitch the excess thread around 1 inch back through the needle. Pull the excess thread backwards until it secures itself. Repeat this process for the second needle and you'll be ready to stitch. Ensure both leather pieces are well aligned and that the stitching holes are wide enough for the needles. If the holes are too tight, use a scratch awl to gently widen them. For stitching, we'll use a cross-stitching method. Start by inserting both needles into the back of the pieces, 1 needle per piece. Pass the needles to their opposite sides, where the other end of the thread is inserted. This will form a neat double stitch on the front of the assembly. Next, cross one needle into the opposite leather piece over the union line, and do the same for the second needle. The needles will now be on the front side. Pass them to their opposite sides again to form a second double stitch. Repeat this process until the entire side is stitched together, ensuring consistent tension and alignment throughout. Once you reach the end of the stitching, go back 1 or 2 cross stitches to reinforce the seam and then trim the thread. However, avoid cutting it too close to the leather. Leave about 1 inch of excess. We'll trim all excess threads once the entire booster assembly is complete. Before cutting, pull the thread gently to secure it firmly, ensuring it won't loosen over time. Next, we'll use the other side of the assembly. While it's still flat, take the opportunity to stitch the upper edge using the traditional saddle stitching method. To estimate the amount of thread you'll need, measure the stitching rung with a ruler and multiply it by 4. I recommend adding an extra 30 cm as a precaution. To saddle stitch without a stitching pony, insert the first needle into the initial hole and pull both needles back to ensure the thread is even on both sides. Then pass the first needle through the next hole. Once its tip emerges, grab it with the second needle and pass the second needle through the same hole. Pull both needles carefully until the stitch lies flat and straight. To ensure the thread is entangled, gently pull it slightly before inserting the second needle. When you're finished, trim the excess thread, leaving some extra length for final adjustments later. Now repeat this process on the smaller sections of the booster. Since these sections are narrower, pre-bend the leather to soften and mold it to the desired shape before stitching. By the end of this process, you should have two separate sections as shown. These won't be stitched together just yet, instead we'll attach the smaller section to the booster support in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll complete the assembly of the entire booster section.